Tonight, we begin a quiet journey. It's a gentle drift through the currents of history, exploring a concept that binds us all together. You know, it's a force that builds cities, funds expeditions, and fuels the ambitions of empires. This force is money. At its heart, money is not merely metal or paper, it's not just a tool for exchange, it is something far more profound. It is a promise, a shared belief, a collective agreement that a small, seemingly insignificant token holds value. This belief allows a farmer to trade his harvest for a coin, confident that the coin can in turn be traded for tools for cloth or for the services of a craftsman. It is a symbol of labor, a vessel for future security, and a testament to social cooperation. This promise is the bedrock of economies both ancient and modern. When we hold a coin or a note, we are holding a piece of that collective trust. We believe in it. And because everyone else believes in it, the system works. It is a silent, unspoken pact that spans entire civilizations. From the bustling markets of ancient Rome to the vast trade routes of the Silk Road, this shared understanding has allowed humanity to build complex societies. It has enabled us to specialize our skills, to plan for the future, and to store the fruits of our efforts in a form that is both portable and durable. The story of money is, in many ways, the story of human ingenuity and our remarkable capacity for mutual faith. But this promise, as powerful as it is also incredibly delicate. The story of currency is a story of trust, and like trust in any relationship, it is far easier to break than it is to build. For centuries, rulers and governments have understood this delicate balance. They knew that the stability of their reign was intrinsically linked to the stability of their money. A strong, reliable currency meant a prosperous populace, a well-funded army, and a thriving network of trade that brought wealth and resources into their domain. The name of an emperor stamped on a coin was more than just a mark of origin. It was a personal guarantee. It was a declaration to the world that this piece of metal was pure, its weight was true, and its value was secure. This trust, however, is a constant temptation. For a ruler facing an empty treasury, the allure of tampering with the currency can become irresistible. Why raise taxes and risk the ire of the people, when one can simply alter the money itself? It is a quiet, almost invisible solution, at least in the beginning. One could recall all the old coins and reissue new ones with just a little less precious metal in each. The difference would be small, hardly noticeable to the untrained eye. This process, known as debasement, creates profit from thin air. It allows a government to mint more coins from the same amount of silver or gold, magically expanding its wealth to pay for wars or grand monuments. At first, this strategy might seem ingenious, a clever way to solve a pressing financial crisis without immediate consequence. The new, slightly less valuable coins circulate alongside the old ones. The markets continue to function, the soldiers are paid, the crisis appears to have been averted. But trust is a fragile thing. Slowly, people begin to notice. Merchants who handle money all day are the first to sense the change. They might weigh the coins, or test their purity. Foreign traders might begin to refuse the newer currency, demanding payment only in the older, purer coins. A quiet anxiety begins to spread. This is the moment when the promise begins to fracture. The coin is no longer a reliable store of value, it is a symbol of deception. People start to hoard the old, good money and spend the new, bad money as quickly as they can. This simple, rational act accelerates the decay. The debased currency floods the market, driving out the trustworthy coins and causing prices to rise as merchants adjust for the lower intrinsic value. The ruler's shortcut, intended to solve a short-term problem, has sown the seeds of a much larger, more destructive crisis. The very foundation of the economy has been weakened from within, all because a promise was quietly broken. Tonight, we will not concern ourselves with the loud, chaotic collapses of modern markets. There will be no frantic stock tickers or shouting traders. Instead, we will drift through a quieter, more ancient gallery of failure. We will visit 5 distinct moments in history, 5 great civilizations that watched their monetary systems crumble. Each story is a chapter in the larger saga of human trust and its betrayal. Our journey is not one of judgment, but of quiet observation. We will become nocturnal visitors to a museum of broken promises, listening to the soft echoes of economies long past as they slowly, and then suddenly, unraveled. Our first stop will be the Roman Empire in the 3rd century. Here we will witness the slow death of the denarius, a silver coin once respected across the known world. We will see how centuries of war and imperial extravagance led emperors to systematically replace the silver with base metals, hollowing out the currency until it was a mere shadow of its former self. We will learn how this decay contributed not just to economic chaos, but to the erosion of the very fabric of Roman society. The fall of Rome was not just a military event, it was also a story of monetary collapse, where citizens lost faith in the symbols that held their world together. From the ashes of Rome, we will travel forward in time to revolutionary France in the 1790s. Here, the crisis was not one of diluted metal but of boundless paper. We will explore the story of the Assignat, a new form of money born from the fervor of revolution. Initially backed by confiscated church lands, these paper notes were a bold experiment, but as the printing presses ran without restraint, they created a flood of currency that drowned the economy in hyperinflation. The promise of land became a promise of nothing, and the value of the assignat evaporated, leaving desperation and hunger in its wake. Our journey will then take us eastward, across continents and centuries. We will visit the vast Mongol Empire of Kublai Khan, where paper money was enforced by imperial decree. We will travel to the Delhi Sultanate in India, to witness a brilliant but disastrous experiment with token copper currency. And finally, we will arrive in the magnificent city of Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire, to see how even the legendary gold solidus, the dollar of the Middle Ages, could be brought low by debasement. Each of these stories is a quiet testament to a recurring pattern. They remind us that money, in all its forms, is ultimately a shared dream, and sometimes we are forced to wake up. Our journey begins in ancient Rome, a civilization that for centuries stood as a beacon of power, order, and engineering. Its legions marched across continents, its aqueducts carried life-giving water to sprawling cities, and its laws shaped the course of Western history. At the very heart of this vast and complex machine was a small silver coin. It was called the denarius. For generations, this coin was the lifeblood of the Roman economy. It paid the soldiers who guarded the frontiers. It funded the construction of magnificent temples and arenas, and it passed through the hands of millions, from senators in the Forum to merchants in the distant provinces of Syria and Britannia. The denarius was more than just money. It was a symbol of Roman stability and its global reach. The coin's name, denarius, simply meant containing 10. It was originally valued at 10 asses, a smaller bronze coin. First minted in the 3rd century BC, it was for a very long time a remarkably reliable piece of currency. Struck from nearly pure silver, its weight and quality were consistent. This dependability made it the most trusted coin in the ancient world. A farmer in Gaul or a craftsman in Egypt could accept a denarius with confidence, knowing its value would hold. This trust was the invisible glue that held the empire's sprawling trade networks together. It allowed goods, ideas, and people to move freely across thousands of miles, all lubricated by this single, respected medium of exchange. The image of the emperor stamped upon the coin was a crucial part of this trust. It was a personal guarantee from the most powerful man in the world. Each new emperor would mint coins bearing his own portrait, a way of announcing his authority to every corner of the empire. This was not just vanity, it was a declaration that the state stood behind the coin's value. When a Roman held a denarius, they held a tangible connection to the emperor himself. They were participating in the grand project of Rome. The coin in their pocket was a miniature monument, a portable piece of propaganda that reinforced the power and permanence of the empire with every single transaction. This golden age of silver could not last forever. The early denarius, particularly under the first emperors like Augustus, was a testament to fiscal discipline. It contained over 95% pure silver. This high standard was a source of immense pride and economic strength. It ensured that savings were secure, and that prices remained stable for long periods. People could plan for the future, invest in their businesses, and pass down wealth to their children, all with a sense of security. But the sheer size of the Roman Empire, and its constant need for expansion and defense, placed an enormous strain on its finances. The seeds of the denarius's destruction were sown not by an outside enemy, but by the very demands of maintaining the empire itself. The slow, creeping decay of the denarius began long before the great crisis of the 3rd century. It was, a story of small compromises, made by emperors who were facing immense pressure. The primary pressure was war. The Roman Empire was in a near constant state of conflict, defending its vast borders from Germanic tribes, Parthians, and other external threats. War is honestly an incredibly expensive business. Armies need to be paid, equipped, and fed. When tax revenues just weren't enough to cover these costs, emperors were faced with a really difficult choice. They could raise taxes, which was, as you might guess, an unpopular move that could lead to rebellion. Or they could find another way to create money. The temptation to tamper with the coinage proved, well, too strong to resist. The first significant debasement is often attributed to the Emperor Nero in the middle of the 1st century AD. Faced with the immense costs of rebuilding Rome after the Great Fire, Nero made a fateful decision. He reduced the silver content of the denarius by about 10%, mixing in cheaper base metals like copper. To the naked eye, the new coins looked almost identical to the old ones. They were the same size and carried the emperor's mark, but they were intrinsically worth less. This was really a quiet deception. It allowed the imperial mint to produce more coins from the same amount of silver, creating a short-term budget surplus. The soldiers were paid, the rebuilding continued, and the immediate crisis seemed to pass. This act set a dangerous precedent. Once the line had been crossed, it was easier for future emperors to cross it again and again. Each successive ruler, facing their own financial emergencies, followed Nero's example. The silver content of the denarius began a long, slow, and irreversible decline. Under the Flavian and Antonine dynasties, the purity of the coin continued to fall, bit by bit. By the reign of Marcus Aurelius in the late 2nd century, the denarius was only about 75% silver. Each reduction was a small, incremental step, but over decades these steps amounted to a significant betrayal of the public's trust. The guarantee of the emperor's portrait was slowly becoming a lie. This process is an example of what is now known as Gresham's law. That is, bad money drives out good. As the new debased coins entered circulation, people naturally preferred to hold on to the older, purer silver coins. They would spend the new, less valuable coins as quickly as possible, while hoarding the old ones as a store of real wealth. This meant that, over time, the currency circulating in the marketplaces was increasingly made up of the worst quality coins. The good money vanished from sight, hidden away in private savings. The very substance of the empire's wealth was being hollowed out, one coin at a time, preparing the ground for the catastrophic collapse that was to come. The 3rd century AD plunged Rome into chaos. Civil wars, invasions, and plagues battered the empire. 26 emperors rose and fell in 50 years, each debasing the denarius further to pay their armies. The silver content of coins collapsed to nearly nothing. The denarius became a bronze fraud. Hyperinflation ravaged daily life. Savings vanished, trade broke down, and barter returned. Soldiers mutinied as their pay became worthless, shattering trust in the state. The empire fractured from within, undone by the collapse of its currency and the trust it once symbolized. By the late 3rd century, Rome's money was meaningless. The Antoninianus replaced the denarius but quickly followed the same path, debased, distrusted, and abandoned. People turned to barter, the market economy withered. The middle class was destroyed, inequality soared, and faith in Rome evaporated. The collapse of currency became a daily reminder of a broken system. The empire rotted from within, its unity and identity lost with the value of its coin. Emperors like Diocletian tried to restore order with new coins and price controls, but trust was already lost. The economy never recovered, the West grew rural and fragmented, drifting from the East. The denarius's fall was a slow, corrosive disaster. Each short-term fix deepened the long-term wound. The bond between ruler and ruled, once stamped in silver, was broken. The coin became a symbol of decay, not unity. Rome's true collapse began not with invasion, but with the loss of trust in its own money. Centuries later, revolutionary France faced its own crisis, bankruptcy, and the need for money. The National Assembly seized church lands and issued assignats, paper notes backed by this real estate. At first, assignats were bonds for the wealthy, meant to stabilize finances, but soon, the government made them legal tender, required in all transactions. The printing press became the state's lifeline, funding the revolution with promises on paper. Confidence held briefly, anchored by land, but the temptation to print more would soon test the revolution's promise. Once assignats became currency, restraint vanished. War and unrest drove the government to print ever more notes, far beyond the value of seized lands. Assignats lost their anchor, becoming mere paper backed by hope and decree. As their numbers soared, value plummeted. Hyperinflation took hold. People rushed to spend assignats before they lost more value, hoarding gold and silver instead. The economy churned feverishly, but real wealth vanished. The printing press, once a miracle, became a curse as trust in money evaporated. The frantic rush to spend the assignats sent prices spiraling upwards. This was the beginning of hyperinflation. A shopkeeper who sold a loaf of bread for 1 livre in assignats 1 week might find that the note was worth only half as much by the next. To protect themselves, they had to raise their prices constantly, just to keep pace with the currency's collapse. This created a vicious cycle. Rising prices caused panic, which led the government to print even more money to cover its own soaring costs, which in turn caused the currency to fall faster and prices to rise even more. The economic engine of France was overheating, threatening to tear itself apart. Life for ordinary people became a nightmare of economic uncertainty. Wages could not keep up with the rocketing cost of living. A worker's salary, paid in assignats, would lose a significant portion of its purchasing power before it could even be spent. Savings were completely wiped out. A family that had carefully put aside a sum of money for the future found their nest egg had become worthless. Bread lines grew longer in the cities. There were riots and protests as people, desperate and hungry, demanded price controls. The revolution, which had promised to liberate the common person, was now starving them through the mismanagement of its own money. The government tried to fight the inevitable. It passed laws making it a crime to refuse to accept assignats at their face value. It made it illegal to trade in the old gold and silver coins. But these measures were futile. They could not legislate trust back into existence. People found ways to circumvent the laws. Black markets thrived where goods were priced in real assets, not in the revolutionary paper. A farmer might secretly sell his produce for a few silver coins rather than accept a wheelbarrow full of worthless assignats. The official economy was a fiction. The real economy had gone underground, reverting to barter and hard currency. By 1795, the situation had reached a point of absurdity. The face value of the notes in circulation had swelled to over 40 billion livres. A note that had once been worth 100 livres in silver was now worth less than a single livre. A simple carriage ride in Paris could cost thousands in paper money. People reportedly used stacks of assignats as kindling for their fires, as the paper was worth more as fuel than as currency. The promise of the revolution, so beautifully printed on each note, had become a cruel joke. The money that was supposed to fund a new era of liberty had instead created a new form of servitude, bondage to a worthless currency. The collapse of the assignat unfolded against one of history's most violent and chaotic backdrops, the Reign of Terror. From 1793 to 1794, the radical Jacobin faction, led by figures like Maximilien Robespierre, seized control of the revolution. As the currency collapsed and hunger gripped the cities, the government responded not with economic reason but with brutal force. They blamed the crisis not on their own printing presses but on speculators, hoarders, and counter-revolutionaries. The guillotine, which had been used to execute the king and queen, was now turned on anyone deemed an enemy of the state, including merchants who refused to accept the worthless paper money. In this climate of extreme paranoia, economic dissent became a capital crime. The government passed the law of the maximum, a draconian set of price controls that fixed the price of essential goods and services. A farmer who sold his grain for more than the mandated price could face the death penalty. A baker who refused to sell bread for the collapsing assignats was branded a traitor. This attempt to control the economy through terror had a chilling effect. Instead of stabilizing prices, it caused goods to disappear from the market entirely. Farmers preferred to let their crops rot in the fields rather than sell them at a loss for worthless currency and risk execution. The cities began to starve. The connection between the monetary chaos and the political terror was direct and undeniable. The government, unable to manage the economy it had broken, resorted to violence to enforce its will. The worthless livre was propped up by the blade of the guillotine. Citizens were forced to make an impossible choice: accept the currency and starve slowly as its value evaporated, or refuse it, and risk immediate execution. This period illustrates a dark truth about fiat currency collapses. When a government's money fails, and it loses the ability to persuade its people, it often turns to coercion. The failure of trust is replaced by the rule of fear. Ultimately, not even terror could save the assignat. Robespierre himself fell from power and was executed in 1794, bringing the reign of terror to an end. But the currency was beyond saving. The more moderate government that followed, known as the Directory, continued to print assignats out of sheer desperation. By 1796, the notes were effectively worth nothing. They had lost 99% of their original value. The grand experiment that had begun with such promise, backed by the vast wealth of the church, had ended in complete and utter failure. The French economy was in ruins, and the people had lost all faith in paper money. By early 1796, the French government was forced to admit defeat. The assignat was a dead currency. The social and economic damage it had caused was immeasurable. Commerce was at a standstill. The state was bankrupt. The people were exhausted and disillusioned. In a final symbolic act of surrender, the government decided to publicly destroy the tools that had created the crisis. On the 19th of February 1796, in the Place Vendôme in Paris, a great bonfire was lit. The printing plates, the dies, the stamps, and all the machinery used to produce the assignats were brought out and solemnly thrown into the flames. It was a public execution of a failed idea. This dramatic gesture was meant to signal a new beginning, a return to monetary sanity. The government attempted to introduce a new paper currency, the mandat territorial, which was also supposedly backed by land. But the public had been burned too badly. No one trusted the government's paper promises anymore. The new notes failed almost instantly, their value collapsing even faster than the assignats had. The experiment with unbacked paper money was over. The people of France, from the richest merchant to the poorest peasant, would only accept one thing: real money. They turned back to the old gold and silver coins that they had hidden away during the years of chaos. The French economy slowly and painfully began to stabilize, but only by returning to a metallic standard. In 1803, a new leader, Napoleon Bonaparte, would introduce the French franc, a coin of a fixed weight and purity in gold and silver. This new, reliable currency would remain stable for over a century, providing the foundation for France's economic recovery and industrialization. The lesson had been learned at a terrible cost. The memory of the assignat collapse was seared into the French national consciousness for generations. The story of the assignat is a stark and cautionary tale. It began as a clever solution to a fiscal crisis, a promise of land transformed into a medium of exchange. But it descended into a tragedy of excess. It shows how quickly a currency, backed only by decree, can be destroyed when the temptation to print becomes too great. The assignat's collapse demonstrates that money cannot be created out of thin air indefinitely. Its value resides in trust, and when that trust is consumed in the fire of hyperinflation, an entire society pays the price. Our journey now carries us eastward, leaving the turmoil of revolutionary Europe far behind. We drift across the great expanse of the Eurasian steppe, arriving in the 13th century. Here, we encounter an empire of unprecedented scale, forged by the legendary Genghis Khan and expanded by his descendants. This is the Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in history. Its dominion stretched from the shores of the Pacific Ocean to the heart of Europe. At its zenith, under the rule of Kublai Khan, the empire was not just a military power but also a hub of trade and innovation. And at the center of its economic life was a concept so alien to European visitors that it seemed like a form of sorcery: paper money. When the Venetian merchant Marco Polo arrived at the court of Kublai Khan in the late 13th century, he was astonished by what he saw. He had traveled from a world where wealth was measured in heavy gold and silver coins. In the Khan's domain, however, the primary medium of exchange was a simple piece of paper. This money, known as chow, was made from the bark of the mulberry tree. It was cut into rectangular notes of various sizes, each bearing the seal of the Great Khan himself. To Polo and to other outsiders, it was a marvel. The idea that a piece of paper with no intrinsic value of its own could be used to buy anything and everything from precious gems to a simple meal was utterly revolutionary. This was not the first time paper money had appeared in China. The concept had been developed centuries earlier under the Song dynasty, but it was the Mongols, under Kublai Khan, who established it as the sole, compulsory legal tender across their vast Chinese territories, which they named the Yuan Dynasty. They created a truly unified, state-managed fiat currency system on a scale never before seen. The notes were not convertible into gold or silver on demand. They were not backed by a promise of land, like the French Assignat. Their value came from one source and one source alone: the absolute authority of the Great Khan. The paper was money because the emperor decreed it to be so. Marco Polo described the process with a sense of wonder. He explained how the mulberry bark was processed into black paper signed by officials and stamped with the vermilion seal of the emperor. This, he wrote, gave the money its authenticity and value. He noted the system's efficiency, how it freed merchants from the burden of carrying heavy sacks of metal coins over long distances. The Mongol paper money was a sophisticated tool of statecraft, a way to centralize economic control, facilitate trade across a sprawling empire, and project the unquestionable power of the Khan into every marketplace and every transaction. It was a system built entirely on command and obedience. The success of the Mongol paper money system, known as Chow, rested on a foundation of absolute, unshakable imperial power. Kublai Khan understood that for a currency backed by nothing tangible to work, its acceptance could not be optional. Therefore he issued a decree that was both simple and brutal. Every person within his domain was required to accept the paper notes as payment for any goods or services. To refuse the Khan's money was to refuse the Khan himself, an act of treason punishable by death. This was not a gentle persuasion or a market-driven adoption. It was a command, enforced by the most severe penalty imaginable. To ensure the paper notes were the only currency in use, the Khan forbade the private ownership of gold and silver. Citizens were ordered to turn in all of their precious metals to the imperial mints. In exchange, they received the new paper, Chow. This policy served two critical purposes. Firstly, it removed all competing forms of money from circulation, giving the paper notes a complete monopoly. Secondly, it allowed the state to accumulate a vast reserve of gold and silver, which it could use for its own international trade or as a war chest. The people were left with paper, while the emperor held the real physical wealth. The system was a testament to the Mongols' genius for centralized control. Marco Polo observed this system with a mixture of awe and disbelief. He wrote, "All his subjects receive it without hesitation because wherever they go, they pay for all their goods with it." He described how merchants from India and other lands, who brought precious stones, pearls, and gold to the Khan's capital, were not paid in coin. Instead, they were compelled to sell their valuable wares to the emperor in exchange for his paper notes. With this paper, they could then purchase the silks, spices, and other goods of the empire. The paper money effectively acted as a tool to draw real wealth from all corners of the world into the emperor's treasury. For a time, the system worked remarkably well. The compulsory acceptance, backed by the threat of death, ensured the notes circulated widely. The economy of Yuan China flourished. The Grand Canal was extended, new roads were built, and trade thrived along the revitalized Silk Road. The paper currency, light and portable, was a significant advantage in such a vast empire. It seemed that Kublai Khan had achieved the alchemist's dream. He had found a way to create wealth from the bark of a tree. But this power, the power to create money at will, contained the seeds of its own destruction. The very ease of its creation would prove to be its fatal flaw. The Mongol rulers, like so many governments before and after them, discovered the immense temptation of the printing press. The ability to create money with such little effort was a powerful tool, but one that required immense discipline to manage. While Kublai Khan maintained a degree of restraint during his reign, his successors were not always so prudent. The empire was constantly engaged in expensive military campaigns, from failed invasions of Japan and Vietnam to suppressing internal rebellions. These ventures required vast sums of money. Rather than raising taxes, the path of least resistance was always to simply print more chow. With each new military campaign or lavish court project, the government authorized the printing of more and more paper notes. The initial cautious issues of currency gave way to a flood of new paper. The state-run workshops churned out notes with little regard for the economic consequences. The fundamental principle that gives any currency its value, scarcity, was abandoned. As the supply of paper money in circulation swelled, its purchasing power began to decline. It took more and more notes to buy the same amount of grain, silk, or iron. The familiar and destructive process of inflation had begun to take hold within the Mongols' Chinese domain. The government made some attempts to control the situation. They periodically introduced new types of paper money, forcing citizens to exchange the old notes for the new ones, often at a disadvantageous rate. This was effectively a form of hidden taxation, wiping out a portion of the people's savings with each new issue. These actions, however, only served to further erode public confidence. People began to understand that the paper in their hands was not a stable store of value, but a tool of state extraction that could be devalued at the whim of the emperor. The decree of the Khan could force them to accept the money, but it could not force them to trust it. The inflation became progressively worse throughout the first half of the 14th century. The court's spending grew more extravagant, and its military needs became more pressing. The printing presses ran faster and faster to keep up. Contemporary records describe prices rising tenfold and then 100-fold. A note that could once buy a substantial measure of rice was soon worth less than the paper it was printed on. The economic stability that had been one of the great achievements of Kublai Khan's reign was unraveling. The sorcery of paper money was turning into a curse, impoverishing the very people it was supposed to serve. By the middle of the 14th century, the Mongol paper currency system was in a state of terminal collapse. The hyperinflation had destroyed the wealth of the common people and honestly shattered the economy. The Great Khan's decree, which had once seemed so absolute, began to lose its power. The threat of death could no longer sustain a currency that had become practically worthless. People began to reject the official paper money, regardless of the consequences. They started to demand payment in anything other than the government's chao. The system, built on command, was breaking down in the face of widespread popular defiance. The people of China, who had a long history with metallic currency, reverted to what they knew and trusted. A silent, grassroots rebellion against the paper money took place. In markets and in private transactions, people began to use copper coins, silver bullion, and even barter. A farmer would rather trade his grain for a piece of silk than for a stack of worthless paper. Merchants who had no choice but to officially accept the paper notes would immediately try to convert them into tangible assets. The official currency was treated like a hot potato, to be passed on as quickly as possible, while the real economy operated on a foundation of hard assets. The Mongol government's authority was severely undermined by this monetary chaos. Their inability to provide a stable currency was seen as a sign of weakness and incompetence. It was a clear indication that they had lost the mandate of heaven, the traditional Chinese concept of divine right to rule. Natural disasters such as floods and famines, which occurred during this period, were interpreted as further proof that the cosmos itself was displeased with the Yuan dynasty's governance. The currency collapse was not just an economic problem, it became a major catalyst for political and social rebellion against Mongol rule. The final decades of the Yuan dynasty were marked by widespread peasant uprisings and civil war. Rebel leaders rose up, challenging the authority of the Mongol court. This internal strife only made the economic situation worse, as both the government and the rebel factions printed their own worthless money to fund their armies. The paper currency system completely disintegrated. By the time the Yuan dynasty was finally overthrown in 1368 and replaced by the native Chinese Ming dynasty, the chao was a forgotten relic. The new Ming rulers, having witnessed the disaster firsthand, initially rejected paper money entirely, returning to a system based firmly on copper coins and silver. The story of Mongol paper money is a powerful illustration of the limits of fiat currency. It demonstrates that a currency's value cannot be sustained by decree alone, even when backed by the most fearsome military power on earth. For a time, the authority of the Great Khan was enough to make the system work, but when that authority was abused through the excessive printing of money, the trust that is essential for any currency to function inevitably collapsed. The Mongols had created a sophisticated system, but they lacked the discipline to maintain it. Their great economic experiment ended in failure, contributing significantly to the downfall of their dynasty in China. The collapse of the chao had lasting consequences. It left a deep-seated distrust of paper money in China that would persist for centuries. The Ming dynasty that succeeded the Yuan was extremely cautious, relying primarily on a metallic currency system. The economic chaos and hyperinflation of the late Yuan period were remembered as a dark time of government mismanagement and popular suffering. The failure became a cautionary tale, a lesson in the dangers of a government having unchecked power over the creation of money. The memory of worthless paper notes blowing through the streets became a powerful symbol of a dynasty that had lost its way. The fall of the Yuan dynasty was, of course, a complex event with many causes, including ethnic tensions, political corruption, and natural disasters. However, The monetary collapse was a critical factor that accelerated the process. It destroyed the economy, impoverished the population, and delegitimized the rulers in the eyes of their subjects. It turned the common people against the government and fueled the rebellions that would ultimately drive the Mongols from China. The very tool that had helped Kublai Khan consolidate his power and manage his vast empire became, in the hands of his successors, a weapon of self-destruction. As we move on from the windswept plains of Asia, the lesson of the Mongol Chao is clear. Trust is more powerful than force. A government can compel its people to use a currency, but it cannot compel them to believe in it. When a state betrays the trust of its people by destroying the value of their money, it undermines its own foundation. The promise of the Great Khan, once stamped in bold red ink on a piece of mulberry bark, was broken. And with it, an empire began to unravel, its power fading just as surely as the value of its paper money had vanished into thin air. Our journey now takes us south, from the vast plains of Mongol China to the vibrant, sun-drenched Indian subcontinent. We arrive in the 14th century, in the powerful Delhi Sultanate. At its helm is a ruler who remains one of the most enigmatic and controversial figures in Indian history, Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq. He was a man of dazzling intellect and boundless ambition. A scholar, a poet, and a military genius, he was fluent in multiple languages and deeply knowledgeable in philosophy, mathematics, and medicine. His court was a center of learning and culture, attracting thinkers from across the Islamic world. He envisioned a grand, unified empire, and he was not afraid to launch bold, unconventional schemes to achieve his goals. Yet for all his brilliance, Tughlaq was also known for his impatience, his erratic temperament, and a shocking lack of common sense. His reign was a whirlwind of audacious projects, many of which were spectacular failures. In one infamous episode, he decided to move the entire capital of his empire hundreds of miles south, from the established city of Delhi to a new location called Daulatabad. He forced the entire population of Delhi to relocate, a brutal and poorly planned march that resulted in immense suffering and death. Eventually the scheme was abandoned, and the exhausted survivors were ordered to march all the way back. This was the character of the Sultan, a man whose grand visions often crashed against the rocks of reality. It was within this context of brilliant but flawed leadership that Tughlaq confronted a serious economic problem. The 14th century saw a global shortage of silver. The mines that had supplied the world with precious metals were becoming depleted, and the value of silver was rising across Asia. For the Delhi Sultanate, this was a critical issue. Silver coins, known as tankas, were the backbone of the economy, used for paying soldiers, funding the state, and conducting large-scale trade. With silver becoming increasingly scarce and expensive, the Sultan's treasury was feeling the strain. He needed a solution to maintain the liquidity of his economy and fund his ambitious military campaigns. True to his character, Muhammad bin Tughlaq did not opt for a simple or cautious solution. He looked to the examples of other great empires. He had heard tales of the paper money used in Mongol China and the token currencies of Persia. Inspired by these accounts and confident in his own absolute authority, he devised a plan that was breathtaking in its audacity. He would not simply debase the existing silver coins by a small amount. Instead, he would introduce a radical new form of currency, one that would solve the silver shortage at a stroke. It was a scheme that perfectly encapsulated his genius, his ambition, and his fatal disregard for the practicalities of human nature. In the year 1329, Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq announced his grand monetary experiment. He introduced a new currency made from base metals, primarily copper and brass. Now, this wasn't unusual at the time. Copper coins were pretty common for small everyday transactions, but the Sultan's radical innovation was in the value he assigned to them. He issued a decree that these new copper coins were to be accepted as having the exact same value as the silver tanka and the gold mohur. So, a simple piece of copper, worth very little on its own, was now declared to be legal tender equivalent to a coin of pure silver. This was token currency in its most extreme form. The Sultan's logic, at least from his perspective, was sound. He understood the abstract nature of money. He believed that the value of a coin was derived not from the metal it contained, but from the authority of the sovereign who issued it. His stamp, his guarantee, should be enough to make a piece of copper function like a piece of silver. If the system worked, it would be a masterstroke. It would instantly solve the silver shortage, allowing the state to conserve its precious metal reserves while flooding the economy with new currency to facilitate trade and fund the army. The government could acquire copper cheaply, stamp it, and spend it as if it were silver, creating immense wealth for the treasury out of thin air. To encourage acceptance, the official copper coins were well crafted. They bore intricate inscriptions in Persian and Arabic, detailing the Sultan's titles and the religious formulas that legitimized his rule. The calligraphy was elegant, and the designs were complex. In theory, these features were meant to make the coins difficult to forge. The Sultan believed that his authority, combined with the sophisticated design of the coins, would ensure the integrity of his new system. He issued his decree across the vast Sultanate, ordering that the new token currency be used in all transactions, from the grandest commercial deals to the purchase of a handful of vegetables in the local bazaar. However, the Sultan made a catastrophic error, an oversight so fundamental that it doomed his entire experiment from the very beginning. While he focused on the authority of his decree and the beauty of the coin's design, he failed to secure the one thing that could have given the system a chance state control over the minting process. The official mints produced the new copper tokens, but the Sultan neglected to make the design sufficiently complex or to put in place any mechanism to prevent private individuals from creating their own versions. This oversight would not just weaken the new currency, it would unleash a wave of economic chaos that would cripple his empire. The Sultan's grand scheme had a fatal flaw, and the people of the Delhi Sultanate discovered it almost immediately. The copper and brass used for the token currency were cheap and widely available, and the intricate design, which the Sultan believed was a security feature, could be replicated by any reasonably skilled metalworker. Craftspeople who could make pots, pans, and jewelry found that they could also make money. The Sultan had failed to maintain a state monopoly on the minting of the new coins. In doing so, he had inadvertently given every household with a furnace and some copper the power to create its own wealth. A tsunami of counterfeiting was unleashed across the empire. Every village, every town, seemed to have its own private mint. According to the chroniclers of the time, the home of every Hindu became a mint. This is likely an exaggeration, but it captures the scale of the crisis. People began to melt down their copper utensils and forge their own token coins. Why work when you could simply create your own money? The result was a massive, uncontrolled explosion in the money supply. No one could distinguish a genuine coin minted by the royal treasury from a fake coin made in a backyard workshop. In effect, they all became fake, as the very concept of an official coin lost all meaning. The Sultan's authority, which he believed was the ultimate source of the currency's value, proved to be powerless. His decree could force people to accept copper coins, but it could not stop them from making their own. The market was soon flooded with a worthless sea of copper. This was not just inflation, it was the complete annihilation of the monetary standard. The value of the token currency plummeted, not day by day, but hour by hour. A coin that was supposed to be worth a silver tanka was soon worth less than the scrap of copper it was made from. The entire economic system was thrown into turmoil. The consequences were felt at every level of society. Foreign merchants who had brought valuable goods to India were horrified. They were forced to sell their wares for the worthless copper tokens, and they quickly stopped trading with the Sultanate altogether, cutting off the supply of imported goods like horses, which were vital for the army. At home, the government itself was cheated. People began paying their taxes and tributes to the state using the counterfeit coins they had minted themselves. The Sultan's treasury, which was supposed to be enriched by this scheme, was soon overflowing with worthless copper, while its reserves of real silver and gold were depleted. The plan had backfired in the most spectacular way imaginable. The economic life of the Delhi Sultanate ground to a halt. With the currency rendered meaningless, trust, the essential ingredient for any transaction, completely evaporated. Markets fell silent. No one wanted to sell valuable, real goods, like grain, livestock, or textiles, in exchange for a handful of copper coins that might have been minted in their neighbor's kitchen. Commerce reverted to its most primitive form, barter. A farmer would trade his rice directly for a potter's wares. An artisan would exchange his services for food. This was inefficient and cumbersome, drastically shrinking the scale and complexity of the economy. The social order began to break down. The salaries of soldiers and government officials were paid in the token currency, rendering their wages worthless. This led to discontent and disloyalty within the state's own apparatus. Land revenues, the primary source of the state's income, were paid in counterfeit tokens, bankrupting the treasury. The entire administrative and military structure of the Sultanate was threatened from within. The Sultan, who had envisioned a stronger, richer state, now found himself presiding over a collapsing economy and a government that could no longer pay its own bills. His brilliant idea had impoverished both his people and his own regime. The historian Ziauddin Barani, who lived through this period, described the chaos vividly. He wrote that the value of the token coin fell so low that it was no more regarded than pebbles or potsherds in the street. The once proud silver tanka was spoken of with longing, a relic from a more stable time. Respect for the Sultan and his government plummeted. The monetary disaster was seen as yet another example of his tyrannical and foolish rule. It alienated powerful nobles, wealthy merchants, and the common people alike, uniting them in their suffering and their resentment of the ruler who had caused it. The crisis became untenable. The economy was paralyzed, the treasury was full of useless metal, and the authority of the state was in tatters. The experiment had been a complete and unmitigated disaster. After about 2 years of this chaos, from 1329 to 1331, Muhammad bin Tughlaq was finally forced to admit his failure. He could not undo the damage he had caused, but he had to put an end to the experiment before it destroyed his kingdom entirely. His solution, like the initial scheme itself, was dramatic and absolute, leading to one of the most remarkable scenes in monetary history. Faced with the ruin of his kingdom, Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq made another extraordinary decree. He announced that he was repealing the token currency, and in a desperate attempt to restore public faith and restart the economy, he promised that the state would redeem all of the copper coins, both genuine and counterfeit, exchanging them for real silver and gold coins from the royal treasury. It was, honestly, an astonishing offer. The Sultan was essentially promising to buy back all the worthless metal that his people had created at its original, inflated face value. This was a move intended to restore his credibility, but, well, it came at a ruinous cost to the state. The response was overwhelming. People from every corner of the Sultanate began hauling their copper tokens to Delhi to exchange them for good money. Streams of citizens arrived at the treasury carrying sacks, carts, and baskets filled with the now defunct currency. The government, true to the Sultan's word, honored the exchange. The royal coffers were drained of their remaining silver and gold, which flowed out to the public in exchange for the mountains of counterfeit copper that flowed in. The state absorbed the entire loss of the failed experiment, bankrupting itself in the process. The chronicler Barani reported that so many copper coins were brought to the treasury that great heaps of them rose up in front of the fortress of Tughlaqabad, where they lay for years afterwards. This mountain of worthless metal stood as a silent, monumental testament to the Sultan's folly. It was a physical symbol of a brilliant idea gone horribly wrong, a monument to a failure of trust between a ruler and his people. The scheme that was meant to fill the treasury had instead emptied it, replacing its precious metals with a pile of scrap copper. The Sultan had saved his people from the immediate crisis, but only by destroying the financial foundation of his own government. The long-term damage was immense. The economy of the Delhi Sultanate was shattered and would take many years to recover. The Sultan's reputation was, frankly, irrevocably tarnished. Though he would reign for 2 more decades, his authority was permanently weakened, and his reign was plagued by rebellions and the fragmentation of his empire. The story of Tughlaq's token currency became a legendary cautionary tale in India, a lesson passed down through generations about the dangers of a ruler who is too clever for his own good. It stands as one of history's clearest and most dramatic examples of how a fiat currency, when not managed with wisdom and absolute control, can lead to disaster, turning the wealth of a nation into a worthless mountain of metal. Our final journey tonight takes us back in time, to the glittering heart of the Eastern Roman Empire. We arrive in the magnificent city of Constantinople. For 1,000 years after the fall of Rome in the West, this great city stood as a bastion of civilization, a bridge between Europe and Asia. This was the Byzantine Empire, the direct heir to Roman power and tradition. At the very core of its enduring strength and prestige was a coin. It was a small disc of pure gold known as the solidus. For over 7 centuries, it was the most stable and trusted currency in the entire world. It was, you could say, the dollar of the Middle Ages, a golden constant in a world of change. The solidus was first introduced by the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great in the early 4th century. He created it to be a coin of exceptional purity and unwavering consistency. Each solidus contained 4.5 grams of nearly pure gold. This standard was maintained with incredible discipline by the Byzantine emperors who followed him. For generation after generation, the weight and fineness of the solidus remained unchanged. This remarkable stability gave it a reputation that was unmatched. From the markets of Kievan Rus to the ports of Egypt and along the trade routes of the Silk Road, merchants knew that a Byzantine solidus was as good as gold itself. It was a universally accepted symbol of value and reliability. The coin was more than just an economic tool, it was a potent symbol of Byzantine power and divine favor. On its face it bore the portrait of the reigning emperor, often depicted alongside Christ or other Christian imagery. This design broadcast a powerful message. It declared that the Byzantine Empire was a Christian state, protected by God, and that its emperor was God's chosen regent on earth. The purity of the gold was seen as a reflection of the purity of the empire's faith and the solidity of its political order. To hold a solidus was to hold a tangible piece of this imperial and religious ideology, a miniature icon that carried the weight of both worldly power and divine authority. This long era of monetary stability was the bedrock of Byzantine prosperity. It allowed for long-term planning, secure savings, and the flourishing of international trade. The state's ability to pay its soldiers and bureaucrats in reliable gold coins ensured the loyalty and efficiency of its vast administration. The government guarded the integrity of the solidus fiercely, understanding that it was one of the empire's most valuable assets. For centuries, the temptation to debase this golden standard, to dilute it for short-term gain, was resisted. The solidus was the empire's pride, a testament to its enduring legacy and its mastery of statecraft. But even this mighty golden constant could not last forever. For centuries, the Byzantine state had weathered countless storms. It had faced invading armies, internal rebellions, and devastating plagues, yet the solidus had remained pure. By the middle of the 10th century, however, the empire began to face new and mounting pressures. A series of ambitious and costly wars against the Arabs in the east and the Bulgars in the Balkans placed an immense strain on the imperial treasury. At the same time, the sources of gold were becoming less secure. The empire was expanding, its administration was growing more complex, and its expenses were rising steadily. The old discipline that had protected the currency for so long began to be tested as never before. The first subtle crack in the golden facade appeared under the reign of Emperor Nikephoros II Phocas in the 960s. Faced with a severe financial crisis, Nikephoros did not dare to tamper with the solidus itself. Its reputation was just too sacred. Instead, he introduced a new gold coin which was officially called the Tetartaron Nomisma. This new coin looked very similar to the solidus, but it was slightly lighter, weighing about 1/12 less. The old full-weight coin was now referred to as the Histamenon Nomisma. The government insisted that the two coins were equal in value, and it began paying its own expenses, such as soldiers' salaries, using the new, lighter Tetartaron, while demanding that taxes be paid in the old, heavier Histamenon. This was a clever but deceptive accounting trick. The state was profiting from the difference, effectively creating a hidden tax and devaluing its own payments. While the purity of the gold was not yet compromised, the principle of unwavering consistency had been broken. A two-tier gold standard had been created, sowing the first seeds of confusion and distrust in the marketplace. Merchants and citizens quickly understood the difference. They would hoard the heavier coins and spend the lighter ones. The introduction of the Tetartaron set a dangerous precedent. It showed that the once inviolable standard of the Byzantine currency was now open to manipulation by emperors in need of funds. This initial subtle debasement by weight was a sign of the immense pressures building within the empire. The decision by Nikephoros Phocas was a symptom of a deeper problem. The traditional sources of state revenue were no longer sufficient to meet its ever-growing commitments. The empire had become overstretched. The introduction of the lighter coin was a short-term solution, a way to patch a hole in the budget without resorting to unpopular tax hikes. But it was a fateful step. It opened the door to further tampering, making it easier for future emperors, facing even greater crises, to take more drastic measures. The first stone had been loosened from the foundation of trust. The slow erosion of the Byzantine currency accelerated dramatically in the 11th century. This was a period of intense military pressure and political instability. The empire was fighting a desperate war on two fronts, against the Seljuk Turks in the east and the Normans in Italy. A succession of weak and short-lived emperors needed vast sums of money to hire mercenaries and fund their campaigns. With the treasury empty, they turned to the most direct solution available to them, the debasement of the gold coinage itself. The process that began with a slight reduction in weight now became a catastrophic reduction in purity. Under emperors like Constantine IX Monomachos and Romanos IV Diogenes, the fineness of the gold coins began a steep and rapid decline. The solidus, now more commonly called the nomisma, was systematically diluted with cheaper metals like copper and silver. By the 1070s, the coin that had once been nearly pure gold, a 24-carat standard, had fallen to as low as 18 carats. A decade later, it was perhaps 10 carats. The debasement was no longer subtle. The coins began to change color, losing their rich golden luster and taking on a pale whitish hue as more silver was added. This debased version of the coin became known as the electrum histamenon, reflecting its composition of gold and silver alloy. The final catastrophic collapse occurred under the Emperor Alexios I Komnenos in the late 11th century. Facing a bankrupt state and an empire on the verge of collapse, Alexios took the drastic step of seizing all the treasures of the church to pay his army. He then reformed the currency completely, but the new gold coin he introduced, the hyperpyron, was only about 20.5 carats fine, or around 85% gold. The old histamenon, which continued to be debased, eventually contained almost no gold at all, becoming little more than a silver-washed copper coin, a worthless token reminiscent of the late Roman Denarius. In the space of just a few decades, the world's most trusted currency had been utterly destroyed. This great debasement was a desperate act of survival by a state in profound crisis. Each emperor who diluted the coinage was not acting out of simple greed, but out of a desperate need to fund the defense of the realm. However, their short-term solutions had devastating long-term consequences. They were sacrificing the empire's greatest financial asset, its reputation for monetary integrity, in order to pay the immediate bills. The trust that had been built over 700 years was squandered in less than 50. The golden constant had been broken, and the economic fallout would be felt across the Byzantine world. The collapse of the solidus plunged the Byzantine economy into chaos. The stable monetary environment that had underpinned its prosperity for centuries was gone. In its place was a confusing and rapidly depreciating mess of different coins with varying levels of precious metal content. Prices for goods and services soared as merchants and producers tried to protect themselves from the currency's falling value. A wage that was paid one month might buy significantly less the next. The hyperinflation destroyed the savings of ordinary people and made any long-term economic planning impossible. The financial security that had been a hallmark of Byzantine life vanished. The debasement shattered the trust between the government and its subjects. Soldiers and officials who were paid in the new, devalued coins felt cheated. This led to a decline in morale and loyalty, further weakening the state at a time when it was most vulnerable. Tax collectors continued to demand payment in high-quality currency, while the state paid its own debts in debased coins. This blatant hypocrisy created widespread resentment and civil unrest. The government's monetary policy was no longer seen as a guarantee of stability, but as a mechanism of exploitation. The social contract was broken. The damage to the empire's international prestige was immense. For centuries, the solidus had been the anchor of global trade. Now, foreign merchants and rulers refused to accept the debased Byzantine currency. Italian city-states like Venice, which had once been key trading partners, began to mint their own pure gold coins such as the ducat, to fill the void. These new reliable currencies quickly supplanted the Byzantine nomisma as the preferred medium for international exchange. The Byzantine Empire lost its status as the world's financial center. Economic power shifted west, to the rising commercial cities of Italy, a change from which Constantinople would never recover. The monetary system became fragmented and chaotic. Within the empire, a multitude of currencies circulated simultaneously. People relied on old, pre-debasement gold coins, the new Italian ducats, silver from the Arab world, and the various debased imperial issues. Every transaction required a difficult calculation, as people had to weigh and assess the metallic content of each coin. The simple, unified monetary system that had been a source of strength was replaced by a complex and inefficient barter-like environment. The economic engine of the empire was choked by this monetary confusion, accelerating its decline. The collapse of the solidus was not the sole cause of the Byzantine Empire's decline, but it was a powerful catalyst and a profound symptom of its decay. The debasement of the 11th century marked a point of no return. The empire that emerged from this crisis under Alexios I Komnenos was a shadow of its former self. It had survived, but its economic foundation had been permanently damaged. The state had sacrificed its long-term financial credibility for short-term survival, a trade-off that would haunt it for the rest of its existence. The golden glow of the solidus, which had once symbolized the empire's power and permanence, had faded. Although the empire would limp on for nearly 4 more centuries, it never regained its former economic dominance. It became increasingly dependent on foreign powers, particularly the Italian maritime republics, whose bankers and merchants now controlled the trade of the Mediterranean. The loss of a stable, prestigious currency meant that the Byzantines could no longer dictate economic terms. They were forced to compete on a playing field where their historical advantage had been erased. The debasement of the solidus was a self-inflicted wound from which the empire never fully healed, contributing to its slow, painful decline. The story of the solidus is a quiet tragedy. It is the story of how even the strongest, most enduring currency in history can be brought down by the pressures of war and the desperate choices of rulers. It shows that a reputation for integrity, built up over centuries of disciplined statecraft, can be destroyed in a single generation of crisis. The Byzantine emperors of the 11th century chose to break a promise that their predecessors had kept for over 700 years. They sacrificed the trust that their currency represented, and in doing so, they weakened the very empire they were trying to save. As we conclude our journey through these fallen currencies, the lesson of the solidus resonates through time. It reminds us that money is always more than just metal or paper. It is a reflection of the society that creates it. It is a symbol of its discipline, its stability, and its trustworthiness. The fall of the solidus was the fall of an idea, the idea of an eternal, unchanging Roman order. When its golden purity was lost, a fundamental part of the Byzantine identity was lost with it, and the great empire began its long, final fade into history. Our quiet journey through the ruins of fallen currencies is now drawing to a close. We have drifted through the halls of history, from the marbled forums of Rome to the bustling markets of Delhi, from the revolutionary fervor of Paris to the golden heart of Constantinople. In each place we have witnessed a different chapter of the same recurring story. It is a story of how trust, the invisible foundation of all money, can be painstakingly built over centuries and then utterly shattered in a matter of years or even months. The echoes of these collapses whisper a timeless and universal lesson about the fragile nature of the promises that hold our societies together. The specific details of each failure are unique. Rome's denarius was slowly hollowed out, its silver replaced by worthless copper in a long, creeping betrayal. France's Assignat was a flood of paper, a revolutionary dream that drowned in a sea of hyperinflation. The Mongol Khans commanded belief in their mulberry bark notes through sheer force, only to find that even the threat of death could not prop up a currency that had been printed into oblivion. The Sultan of Delhi's brilliant token scheme was undone by a simple, fatal oversight, unleashing a wave of counterfeiting that turned his kingdom's wealth into a mountain of scrap metal. Each story is a distinct tragedy, a unique monument to failure. Yet beneath these distinct narratives lies a common thread. In every case, rulers and governments, faced with overwhelming pressures, chose the path of least resistance. They chose to create money from nothing rather than make difficult political or fiscal choices. Whether by diluting metal, running printing presses, or issuing token coins by decree, they broke the fundamental promise that their currency was a reliable store of value. They sacrificed long-term stability for short-term gain, and in doing so, they unleashed economic forces that they could not control. The consequences were always the same: chaos, impoverishment, and a profound loss of faith in the governing authority. These stories are not merely historical curiosities. They are quiet reminders that the value of money is not intrinsic. It is not inherent in the metal, the paper, or the digital entry. Its value is a shared belief, a collective act of faith. This faith is a precious and delicate thing. Once broken, it is incredibly difficult to restore. The citizens of these fallen empires learned this lesson at a terrible cost. They saw their savings evaporate, Their commerce grind to a halt and their social order crumble, all because the symbol of trust in their pocket had become a symbol of deception. The echoes of their experience resonate even now, a soft warning across the ages. As the night deepens and our journey concludes, we leave these stories behind. We have stood as silent observers to the slow, inexorable decay of the Denarius, the Solidus, the Assignat, the Chow, and the Tughlaq Tanka. Each collapse was a quiet catastrophe, a dissolution of the bonds that connect a people to their state and to each other. They show us that currencies do not fail because the metal is impure or the paper is thin. They fail when the people stop believing. They collapse, not in the mint or the treasury, but in the minds of the millions who use them every day. The final collapse is a collapse of meaning. The narratives we have explored are not about economics alone, they are human stories. They are about the desperation of a Roman soldier receiving a worthless coin, the hunger of a Parisian family whose life savings can no longer buy bread, and the frustration of an Indian merchant forced to accept a counterfeit token. They are about the loss of a future that was once thought to be secure. The failure of money is a deeply personal crisis, repeated millions of times over, until the entire economic fabric of a nation unravels. It is a quiet but profound form of chaos, undermining the very predictability needed for a peaceful and prosperous life. Tonight we have walked through a quiet museum of these broken promises. We have seen how the allure of easy money has tempted rulers throughout history, and how that temptation, once indulged, almost always leads to ruin. The patterns are timeless. The pressures of war, the desire for grandeur, the avoidance of hard decisions, these are the recurring forces that lead governments to debase the currency and betray the trust of their people. The technology changes from hand-hammered coins to industrial printing presses, but the fundamental human dynamic remains the same. The lessons are written in the dust of empires. You have been listening to Fall Asleep to Fiat Failures. We thank you for drifting through history with us, for listening to these quiet tales of collapse. The night is now still, the echoes of the past have faded. May your own foundations of trust remain solid, and may your rest be deep and untroubled. The journey is over, sleep well.